Thank you for joining us today for Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We are covering Section K, Representations and Certifications, in this special topics two-part webinar series. Today, we will be covering the FAR Part 52 portion, and next week, on August 11th, our speaker will be covering the DFARS Part 252 section. These webinars will both be at 11 a.m. Eastern. Our webinars are provided complimentary, and they are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 450 of our government contracting webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you do have questions for our speaker, we will have her information on the last slide of the presentation today. And a little bit about us, we work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance, and more information can be found on our website. I wanted to highlight an additional webinar we are holding this year. The title of this webinar is Fiscal New Year Kickoff Best Practices, and it will be on October 1st at 12 p.m. Both the sponsor link and registration link can be found on your screen and on our website. Our speakers will be covering market research, marketing, sales and capture, proposal writing, and compliance. Sponsorships are available. Please email hello@jenniferschaus.com for pricing details. I also wanted to inform you of a new series that we're holding this year. We have launched a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. This is a live webinar series held each month, and these will take place on the second Friday of each month in 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern. We have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen, and then take your live questions about that topic. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals, and you can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available. Please email hello@jenniferschaus.com for a media kit with pricing details. Also, please note that you can use code DFARS for a $15 discount on each of these webinars. So this month, we are covering compliance with Jacob, Ryan, Rebecca, and Mark. And in September, we will be covering oral presentations with Rena, Troy, Deborah, and Andre. On October 8th, we will be covering set-asides with Anna, Eric, Cy, and Tim. In November, we will be covering pricing with Michael, Marcia, Tracy, and Jeff. And lastly, in December, we will be covering M&A with Shirley, Joshua, Kate, and Brad. Again, a reminder that you can get a $15 discount on each of these webinars with code DFARS to bring your cost to only $20. Okay, and now to introduce our speaker, Diana Lynn Curtis McGraw. Welcome, Diana. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you, Hunter. I appreciate it. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. Today we'll be covering what's known as Section K, the representations and certifications that you see in solicitations when you are submitting your bids. We will go ahead and take a look here at the next slide, and we'll go over the agenda we'll cover today. Today we will be covering the meaning and purpose of the representations and certifications, and specifically we will be covering those FAR clauses that are identified in the reps and certs, including independent price determination and disclosures, prohibited actions and business identification, debarment, conviction, and taxes, place of performance, those compliance matters related to small business and equal opportunity, environmental related matters, Buy American and Trade Agreement Act, and other prohibitions. Additionally, at the very end, we will cover a few additional FAR clauses related to construction, and we will conclude with a short summary of the FCA. Next slide. So when you are submitting your proposals, you will often see what's referred to as a Section K. And if you look at this schedule that's on the screen in front of you, you'll see that most solicitations are broken up into several parts. And Section K is oftentimes listed as the representation, certifications, and other statements of offerers or respondents. So we're going to go into further detail to help provide some additional understanding with regards to what those requirements are, what those certifications and representations state, so that you can accurately respond. Next slide. With regards to FAR 4.1201, this requires that Section K representation certifications includes SAM, and oftentimes there are additional provisions requiring offerers to represent and certify during this process. Don't be misled to think that SAM is the only representations and certifications that you need to review. Oftentimes, despite the fact that that agencies are only required to incorporate by reference the reps and certs, you'll oftentimes find them in their entirety listed in the solicitation, and it's important because they may incorporate unique representations and certifications based on the agency providing the solicitation. This session today will cover those that are related to the FAR, and then next week we will take a look at those that are related to the Department of Defense and the DFARS. Next slide. So why is this important? It's important because what you don't want to happen is that you be considered a non-responsive bidder due to your failure to certify or ensure that the information that is not only in SAM but is also listed in your proposal or your submission is the same and accurate and correct. And so if you take a look back in 2015, there was a case that came before the GAO and with the Department of the Navy, in which the respondent, the offeror, in this case Nationwide, identified itself as a small business in its proposal or its submission, but they failed to appropriately represent itself in SAM.gov as a small business. And Nationwide then appealed to the GAO because what happened, the Navy ended up awarding the bid to another bidder despite the fact that Nationwide had the lowest price. So it's extremely important that you verify and confirm that this information is accurate and correct, not only because you want to make sure that the information is true and to safeguard against any types of misrepresentations, but additionally because important to your business is the ability to win and obtain work. Let's take a look at the next slide. So let's now look at the overview of FAR 52204-8, which are your annual representations and certifications. This section has 4 major parts, and we're going to go through each of them in detail so that you can have a better understanding as to what the requirements are. Obviously, Section A that you see on the screen here, this is completed by the contracting officer or the agency presenting the bid. They will identify what NAICS code is applicable to the acquisition, and additionally, which size standards are applicable based on the NAICS code identified. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is Part B. This is the second major part that we're going to cover with regards to this FAR provision. And what it states is if the provision of 52204-7, which is the System for Award Management, is included in your solicitation, then paragraph D of the provision applies. And just to be clear, paragraph D says that the offeror has completed the annual representations and certifications electronically in SAM. Otherwise, if that provision is not incorporated, you will have to complete paragraph 2, which states whether or not you, the offeror, have completed the individual reps and certs that are identified in SAM.gov. And you would identify either yes, that you have, and you would say paragraph D applies, or you would check mark paragraph D does not apply, and the offeror has completed the individual reps and certs in the solicitation itself. And just to be clear, where you would find this, when you are looking at your proposal, the RFP or the RFQ that you're looking at, it will have a a list of FAR provisions that it either incorporates in full text or by reference, and you would see a provision that says 52204-7. And then you would make the applicable, identification based on that, based on whether or not that provision is located in the solicitation or not. Next slide. This is section C of FAR 52204-8, and what we're going to cover are all of these different categories. There are approximately 8 of them. There are quite a few different FAR provisions within these 8, and we've kind of clumped them together based on what they fall within, and we're going to go through each of those today. Now, I do know this is a lot of information we're going to get through, so I am going to move pretty quickly. But if you have questions about any of these, please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. So let's take a look at the next slide. The first provision we're going to review is the certification of independent price determination. This clause applies in solicitations when a firm fixed price contract or a firm fixed price contract with economic price adjustment is contemplated by the agency, unless, and there are three exceptions. The 3 exceptions are if the acquisition is made under simplified acquisition procedures, 2, the solicitation is a request for technical proposal under a 2-step sealed bidding procedure, or 3, the solicitation is for the utility solicitations, which rates are set by law or regulation. So this clause essentially bans any communications that are for the purpose of restricting competition. The clause prohibits disclosing prices to any other offerors before a bid opening. This clause can become an issue when you have, if you are at a fairly large corporate structure that has multiple subsidiaries, and those subsidiaries may also be bidding on this work. So it's important if the company you are with has a complex structure that you are communicating with each other and also not communicating for the purpose of restricting competition. Additionally, you don't want to disclose the offer between your subsidiaries if that's the case. So let's take a look at the next slide. This is, again, is still related to the certification of independent price determination. Essentially, by signing you are certifying that all subsection A has been met, which are those 3 items we just covered. Additionally, FAR 52203-2C states that if the offeror deletes or modifies paragraph A2 of this provision, the offeror must furnish with its offer a signed statement setting forth in detail the circumstances of the disclosure. So any wrong representations during the solicitation stage leads to a non-responsive bid. And recently, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division announced the formation of a new procurement collusion strike force focusing on deterring, detecting, investigating, and prosecuting antitrust crimes such as bid rigging, conspiracies, and related fraudulent schemes which undermine competition in government procurement, grant, and program funding. So it's extremely important that you take, care and are diligent when you're performing this section of the reps and certs. Next slide. Before we, come off of this topic of the independent price determination and disclosures, I do want to just, reference a case to you. This is United States versus Jir Shin Korea Company, and in this case, oil companies in South Korea communicated through email and phone calls to set the price for each line item in the solicitation, and they co-conspired to rig the bids. The Antitrust Division required the defendants to pay $2 million to the United States for the portion of losses the United States suffered because of the solicitation bid conspiracy. So it's important, to know that there are penalties here, and you really want to be careful and not participate in any type of bid rigging out there that may occur between different offerors. If the solicitation is expected to exceed $150,000, which is often the case for a lot of contracts, offerors must certify to the best of its knowledge and belief that no federal appropriated funds have been paid or will be paid to any person for influencing or attempting to influence an officer or employee of any agency, a member of Congress, an officer or employee of Congress, or an employee of the member of Congress on its behalf in connection with the awarding of the contract. This provision specifically is influenced by the Byrd Amendment. The Byrd Amendment prohibits federal contractors from using federal appropriated funds to influence an offer or any agency with the awarding of that certain contract. Let's take a look at the next slide. Additionally, this also comes with penalties. This is related to FAR 52203-11. This relates to certification and disclosure regarding payments to influence certain federal transactions. There are not criminal but civil penalties of not less than $10,000 and not more than $100,000 for each such failure. And on August 21st of 2015, the Department of Justice announced that Sandia Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of Lockheed Martin, violated the Byrd Amendment and the False Claims Act by using the money allocated by Congress for carrying out National Laboratories' mission to instead lobbying Congress for more funding. Sandia Corporation agreed to pay $4.7 million to resolve these allegations. So it's extremely important if you are participating in any type of lobbying activities that you are not making any payments that could in some way be perceived to be a payment to encourage an agency to award you a contract. Let's take a look at the next slide. We're now going to move on to prohibited actions and business identifications. So looking at FAR 52203-18, this is a prohibition on contracting with entities that require certain internal confidentiality agreements or statements, and you have to provide a representation. I listed on the screen the representation you have to provide. And what's important here is that this specific FAR provision provides that internal confidentiality agreements or statements means a confidentiality agreement or any other written statement that the contractor requires any of its employees or subcontractors to sign regarding non-disclosure of contractor information, except that it does not include confidentiality agreements arising out of civil litigation or confidentiality agreements that the contractor employees or subcontractors sign at the behest of the federal agency. So it's important to evaluate whether or not you are in some way, shape, or form restricting or prohibiting your employees or your subcontractors from lawfully reporting to the government. And you will often, the place where you would find this violation would be likely either in your employee agreements, if you have those, or it would be in your code of conduct if somehow you have a restriction that says that they aren't able to lawfully report to the government. You would also want to look at whether or not you have any confidentiality agreements that you have your employees sign. So it's important there just to kind of just double check things before you provide the certification to the government that you have not in any way, shape, or form restricted or prohibited your employees from lawfully reporting waste, fraud, or abuse. This is specifically important with regards to whistleblowers, and again, just really review those employment contracts to make sure that there aren't any non-disclosure agreements, or provisions. Let's take a look at the next slide. You'll often see in the list of FAR provisions, FAR 52204-3, taxpayer identification. This provision really applies to solicitations that do not include the provision 52204-7. Obviously, the offerers are representing the information to comply with the debt collection requirements of 31 U.S.C. Section 7701C. This specifically means or relates to when the government uses this information to collect and to report on any delinquent amounts arising out of the offeror's relationship with the government. If the resulting contract from the solicitation is subject to the payment reporting requirements described in FAR 4.904, the TIN provided hereunder may be matched with the IRS records to verify the accuracy of the offeror's TIN. So this one, again, is a relatively easy one in that you'll see it in most solicitations. You will identify your TIN, TIN in item D, which you will check mark your TIN and then list out your number. If you don't have a TIN, you'll identify that there as well. So you've either applied for it or it's not required because you're a non-resident alien or foreign corporation that does not have income effectively connected with the conduct or trade of a business in the United States. You will often see that when you're performing work for an agency overseas and you are a foreign corporation performing that work. Let's take a look at the next slide. And we're going to continue with the taxpayer identification information. You will then be asked to identify what the type of organization you have. This is relatively self-explanatory, but it's important for you to make sure it's marked accurately. Let's take a look at the next slide. Additionally, if you have a common parent, if you are if you're wholly owned by someone else, you'll have to identify that information as well. And just to be clear, a common parent means that a corporate entity that owns or controls the affiliated group of corporations that files its federal income tax returns on a consolidated basis, of which the offeror is a member. Let's take a look at the next slide. This FAR provision is whether or not you are a woman-owned small business, and it's FAR 52204-5, and you simply will identify whether or not your business is woman-owned. And to be clear, and we'll get into this a little further later on in the presentation, woman-owned means that your concern is at least 51% owned by one or more women, and that it's controlled. The daily business operations are controlled by one or more women. Let's take a look at the next slide. Additionally, with regards to prohibited actions, this is FAR 52204-26, covered telecommunications equipment or services. This, if everybody recalls, relates to Section 889 of the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. I'm sure that you've heard a lot about Section 889. The Department of Defense, the DFARS version of this is the CMMC, and it's something that has probably come up significantly. And I believe that Jennifer Schaus already provided a presentation related to this earlier this year, which you can access on her website. That being said, let's just get into a little bit of it. We could spend an entire day here, obviously, but we will quickly kind of go over the representations. The FAR Council released an interim rule last year that went into effect August of 2020, and that rule implemented Section 889A1B. That interim rule required contractors to provide a representation after conducting a reasonable inquiry regarding their use of covered telecommunications equipment or services when submitting an offer. The interim rule applies to acquisitions of commercial items, including cost items, and to purchase at or below the simplified acquisition threshold. Contracts, task orders, delivery orders, blanket purchase agreements, and basic ordering agreements must contain a clause that requires reporting if use of covered telecommunications equipment or services is discovered during performance of the contract. So with that being said, let's just define reasonable inquiry a little further. It's an inquiry designed to uncover any information in the entity's possession about the identity of the producer or provider of covered telecommunications equipment or services used by that entity that excludes the need to include an internal or third-party audit. Additionally, it's important to note that unlike Section 889A1A, which flows down to all subcontractors and lower tiers, Section 889A1B prohibition will not flow down and stops at the prime contractor level. And that reason is because it's the only entity that the agency enters into a contract with, and the agency does not directly enter into a contract with any subcontractors at any other lower tier. So that's your basics with regards to Section 889. Again, this is one I would spend significantly more time with. It's important, and I think it will become increasingly important as time goes forward. Unless the FAR were to provide more specific guidance or more rigorous guidance like the Department of Defense. So let's now take a look and see what those covered telecommunications equipment or services, what they include. So next slide. Again, here is not an entire list, but covered telecommunications equipment or services include those equipments produced by Highway Technologies or ZTE Corporation. Additionally, if you look down this list, you'll find if it's anything where the video surveillance equipment or services are produced or provided by Hytera Communications Corporation, and I can't quite pronounce all of these different companies, but there's quite a list. You definitely want to go through these to make sure that you're not in violation in this area. Now, that being said, this clause does not prohibit contractors from providing a service that connects to the facilities of a third party, such as a backhaul, roaming, or interconnection arrangement. Additionally, telecommunications equipment that cannot route or redirect user data traffic or permit visibility into any user data or packets that such equipment transmits or otherwise handles. Again, this is a really technical section. I highly encourage you to follow up further to ensure that you are in compliance with the representations you are making. Let's take a look at the next slide. Briefly, we're going to cover FAR 52209-2. This is your prohibition on contracting with inverted domestic corporations. Again, in essence, this prohibition is on contracting with inverted domestic corporations. It does not apply to any federal government contract or task order entered into before November of 2015. Any agency head may waive the prohibition. And as far as what an inverted domestic corporation is, there's a fairly lengthy definition, but it's a foreign incorporated entity that's treated as an inverted domestic corporation. Next slide. We're now going to move into what we group together as those responsibility matters that relate to debarment, conviction, and tax. The first FAR provision we'll cover is FAR 52209-5. This is a certification regarding responsibility matters. This one's pretty self-explanatory. You want to check and make sure that none of the principals and the offeror are not presently debarred, suspended, or proposed for debarment, and have not within the 3-year preceding this offer been convicted of a civil judgment rendered against them for commission of fraud or any other criminal offense in connection with obtaining or attempting to obtain or performing a government federal contract. Let's take a look at the next slide. Now, it's important to note, while 52209-5 seems to require offerors and any of its principals to look back to its 3-year record, if the contract or if the offeror has active contracts that exceed $10 million, the offeror must look back 5 years. There is, on sam.gov, a database where you can look through and see who is on the list of excluded individuals or businesses. And oftentimes you will see companies that do a lot of significant federal work. It will be one of the steps in their hiring practice. When they go to hire someone who is a principal, they will run this check at that time. Let's take a look at the next slide. Again, so here we're just, this is the next section in this same FAR provision, which says that an offeror or any of its principals has or has not within the last 5 years in connection with the award to or performance by the offeror of a federal contract been the subject of a proceeding at the federal state level that resulted in the following dispositions. And so we're looking for anyone who has an administrative proceeding with a finding of fault and liability for a payment of a monetary fine or penalty greater than of $5,000 or more, and the payment or reimbursement, restitution, or damages in excess of $100,000. And again, this look back is 5 years for any offeror who has more than $10 million in government contracts. Let's take a look at the next slide. And here we're looking at those offerors that have been involved in the last 5 years in any occurrence listed in C1 of this provision. You do have to report and disclose that information in accordance with the active registration in sam.gov. You provide that information to FAPIS. Let's take a look at the next slide. And here, this is our last slide that will cover this certification, this 52209-5, and it's important that federal taxes are considered delinquent if both of the following criteria apply: that the tax liability is finally determined, and that the taxpayer is delinquent in making payments. Let's take a look at the next slide. We're now going to move on to FAR 52209-11. This is representations by corporations regarding delinquent tax liability or a felony conviction under any federal law. What's important to note here is that the government will not enter into any contracts with any corporation that has unpaid federal tax liability or was convicted of a felony criminal violation under any federal law within the preceding 24 months. This is extremely important, and this is another reason why when you are going through your general hiring practices, you should be checking for any principles of your corporation or for the corporation itself and whether or not they have any of these issues, whether the corporation itself has not paid its federal tax liability or whether or not the corporation has been convicted of a felony criminal violation. And again, this provision applies to all solicitations to protect the taxpayer's money. It's not limited to any single type. This provision also broadens the scope of tax representation requirements. Unlike FAR 52209-5, which we saw just a moment ago, which required a 3-year look back for tax delinquency, FAR 52209-11 requires offerors to represent any tax delinquency, so not limited just those that have occurred within the last 3 years. In December of last year, 2020, the United States Department of the Army issued a policy alerting and reminding contractors that failure to take the required steps in representing under this clause prior to award may result in a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Let's take a look at the next slide. And again, we're still in tax matters here. This is FAR 52209-12. This provision is not part of the standard 52204-8 representations and certifications. This is only if the contract price exceeds $5.5 million, and the contracting officer must insert this provision in your solicitation. Let's take a look at the next slide. We're now going to move on to place of performance. So this FAR provision, FAR 52.214-14, this one is specifically for sealed bidding, and it applies to solicitations unless the place of performance is specified by the government. So if the place of performance is specified by the government, this provision is not applicable. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is place of performance 522.15-6. This is for everything that is not sealed bidding. What's important to note here is that in certain situations, as many of us have experienced during the unprecedented pandemic of this past year, the Department of Defense has allowed flexibilities in place of performance. So there are some adjustments that are being made based on the circumstances we're currently under with regards to COVID. That being said, this is something that, again, is only applicable if the government does not identify the place of performance. Let's take a look at the next slide. We're now going to move on to compliance matters. These relate to small business and equal opportunity. And we're going to start with 52.219-1, which is the small business program representations. Again, this is another topic that could be an entire presentation in itself. These are whether or not you fall into any of the socioeconomic categories presented by the SBA. So this slide will be completed by the contracting officer to identify which NAICS codes are applicable and those size standards to determine whether or not whether a business is small or not based on the NAICS code identified. Let's take a look at the next slide. Here, what you're going to do, you're going to identify whether or not your business is small or not underneath the applicable NAICS code. I highly encourage you, if you don't know whether or not your business is small, that you contact your local SBA office to review, and they have other resources available to you that can help you identify whether or not your business is small. Additionally, the SBA provides what's called different PTAC offices, procurement technical assistance centers. These are located all over the country, and they are also available to help guide you and provide you an additional resource in determining your size status. You'll see here underneath item C2, they want you, the offeror, to represent whether or not your business is a small disadvantaged business. Let's go ahead and turn the slide and we'll talk about what the qualifications are of a small disadvantaged business. So if you go to 13 CFR 124.1002, it asks the very question, what is a small disadvantaged business? And it provides this response that reliance on the 8A criteria in determining whether or not your firm would qualify as an SDB. Let's take a look at the next slide. So more generally, an SDB eligibility criteria includes, depending on, you have to be small first, is the first step, and that's based on which NAICS code is applicable to you. And let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. and get into some of the more specific details other than being small. You must be unconditionally owned. The applicant or participant must be at least a 51% unconditionally owned and directly owned owner. You're not limited, you could be either a partnership, a limited liability company, or a corporation, but in either regard, you must own 51% of either the stock or the interest. Let's take a look at the next slide. Additionally, you must be socially disadvantaged individuals, so who are subject to racial or ethnic prejudice or cultural bias within the American society. There is a rebuttable presumption that the following individuals are socially disadvantaged, and they include Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Pacific Americans, anyone from Taiwan, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Korea, the Philippines, the U.S. Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and there is a long list of these where you can find this list in the CFR to go through them. Important to note that just because you're born in a country, that by itself does not suffice to make your birth country your individual country for origin purposes. You must be included within a designated group. So let's take a look at the next slide. This takes us to FAR 52.219-1. We're still in that small business program representations, but now we're moving on to women-owned small business. This is as we discussed earlier in one of the prior FAR provisions. You want to identify in Section 4 whether or not you are a woman-owned small business concern. And if you are a joint venture that is underneath this process as well, you would identify that there too. Let's take a look at the next slide. And in all likelihood, if you are, just to note, as far as the joint ventures go, that's not only for those that are underneath the All Small SBA Mentor Protege program, but those are also joint ventures between small businesses who are partnering together. This slide that we're reviewing now is going to cover the subcategory of economically disadvantaged women-owned small business. This is EDWOSB. You'll identify whether or not you fall within any, within these categories. Specifically, if you're socially disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged, in addition to being woman-owned. Let's take a look at the next slide. This section of the small business program representation covers veteran-owned small business concerns. You must be at least 51% owned and controlled by one or more veterans. Additionally, there is an option for those that are service disabled veteran-owned, and you would identify if you are service disabled veteran-owned. Same thing, 51% owned or controlled by one or more service disabled veterans. Let's go on to the next slide. Second to last of these small business programs. This is Hub Zone. Hub zones are qualified that based on the census tracts, located areas where there are historically underutilized business zones. The Hub Zone map will, you can view that at the SBA's website to determine whether or not your business's principal office is located in a Hub Zone area. Let's take a look at the next slide. So it's important, we just went through quite a few small business program representations, and what you're going to see here under Section D is that the government's putting you on notice that any person who misrepresents your firm's status could be punished by an imposition of a fine, imprisonment, or both, subject to administrative remedies, including suspension and debarment, and that you are ineligible for participation in programs conducted under the authority of the Act. Let's take a look at the next slide. The SBA recently released a final rule last year in October of 2020 that went effective in November of 2020. Here is some additional webinars that you can go to that discuss that final rule in more detail, that cover these specific programs a little more thoroughly. Let's take a look at the next slide. We're now going to move on to FAR 52219-2. This is equal low bids. This provision applies to solicitations when contracting by sealed bidding, and the contract will be performed in the United States or its outlying areas. This provision, again, only applies to small business concerns. Let's take a look at the next slide. On this provision, this is FAR 52.222-22. This is previous contracts and compliance reports. You, the offeror, must identify whether or not you participated in a previous contract or subcontract that's subject to equal opportunity clauses, and whether or not you have filed all required reporting compliance, required compliance reports. Let's take a look at the next slide. 52.22 and 222-25. This is affirmative action compliance. Again, it's the same thing. The solicitation, you are going to certify whether or not you have developed or have on file established an affirmative action program required by the rules and regulations of the Secretary of Labor. If you haven't had any previous contracts subject to written affirmative action programs, you would identify that here. Let's take a look at the next page. And I'm going to try to move quickly. We do only have a few more minutes and quite a few slides. As you can tell, this is a lot of information we're going to get through. The next slide really discusses affirmative action compliance. There's what's important to note here is that the OFCCP intends to closely look at the pandemic period and future audits to ensure that companies do not discriminate or retaliate in employment actions being taken, and that affirmative action and equal opportunity continued during the period of COVID. And that is a statement that came out of the U.S. Department of Labor. Additionally, Executive Order 11246 requires that contractors take affirmative action and prohibits federal contractors from discriminating on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or national origin. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is compliance with the Veterans Employment Reporting Requirements. This is your VETS 100 report. Each contractor shall report at least annually to the Secretary of Labor on the number of employees in the workforce of such contractor by category and job hiring and location, and the number of such employees for each of those items, the total number of new employees hired by the contractor during the period covered by the report, and the maximum number and minimum number of employees of such contractor during the period covered by the report. So it's important to file your VETS 4212 report. You have until September 30th of each year to do so. Let's go on to the next page. This is historically Black colleges or universities and minority institutions representations. This is only applicable to those Black colleges or universities. Some examples of historically Black colleges are, for instance, Howard University, and there are quite a few others. There's a long list that you can locate of historically Black colleges or universities, and you would identify whether or not you meet those qualifications. Most standard government contractors are not going to fall into that category unless you are doing research at a university. Let's take a look at the next slide. These are environmentally related matters. I am going to quickly go through these so that we can get to some of the Buy American issues. Let's go ahead and take a look here. This provision applies to solicitations that require the delivery or specify the use of USDA designated items. So let's go ahead and turn the page. $52.223-2, affirmative procurement of bio-based products under services and construction contracts. This provision is applicable unless the contract will not involve the use of USDA designated items. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. This FAR regulation is in conjunction with Section 9002A2 of the DFARS, which requires procuring agencies to procure qualified bio-based products composed of the highest percentage of bio-based content practicable. Just to be clear on what bio-based products are, they are determined by the Secretary to be commercial or industrial products that are composed in whole or in significant part of biological products, including renewable domestic agricultural materials and forestry materials, or intermediate ingredients or feedstocks. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is FAR 52.223-4 recovered material certification. This provision applies to solicitations that are for or specify the use of EPA designated items. This provision does not apply to acquisition of commercially available off-the-shelf items. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is FAR 52.223-22 public disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions and reduction goals. This provision applies to solicitations that include the clause 52.204-7. And again, you will be making representations on whether or not you have publicly disclosed your greenhouse gas emissions. Let's take a look at the next slide. Again, this is a simple representation. The FAR provision does not mandate federal contractors to have greenhouse gas emission reporting in place, just so you know. However, in a recent executive order, President Biden ordered the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council to consider amending the FAR to ensure that major federal agency procurements minimize the risk of climate change, including requiring the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions to be considered in procurement decisions, and where appropriate and feasible, give preference to bids and proposals from supplies with lower social cost of greenhouse gas emissions. So we may see in the near future some changes to this FAR provision, but as of right now, there is no requirement in place or mandate that federal contractors have greenhouse gas emission reporting in place. Let's take a look at the next slide. We're now at the Buy American provisions. This could be also an entire presentation in itself. What's important here is that with the recent executive order, the Buy American Act is once again subject to change. The new executive order 14005 issued by Biden's administration commands the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council to consider proposing for notice and public comment to the applicable provisions in the FAR that would replace the components test in Part 25 of the FAR that is used to identify domestic products and domestic construction materials with a test under which the domestic content is measured by the value that is added to the product through U.S.-based production or U.S. job supporting economic activity, increased numerical thresholds for domestic content requirements and for end products and construction materials, and increase the price preference for domestic end products and domestic construction materials. Let's take a look at the next slide. This FAR 52.225-2 Buy American certificate. This provision applies to solicitations containing the clause 52.225-1 with a value exceeding the micro purchase threshold, but not exceeding $25,000, and in solicitations and contracts, the value exceeding $25,000 unless certain exceptions are met. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is FAR 52.225-4, the Buy American Free Trade Agreements with Israeli Trade Act certificates. Here you're going to identify whether or not you have any free trade agreements with country end products other than Bahraini, Moroccan, Omani, and Panamanian or Peruvian. Let's go on to the next slide. And I know I'm going very quickly. We have just a few minutes left, and I'm just trying to get through these last few slides here. What's important to note here is that with regards to with both Buy American Act or Trade Agreement Act waivers, when they don't apply to the solicitation requirements, the offeror can request a determination regarding the inapplicability of the Buy American statute on construction materials and construction materials under trade agreements, specifically where the cost of the domestic construction material exceeds the cost of foreign materials by more than 6%. Let's take a look at the next slide. Here, this is a prohibition on conducting restricted business operations in Sudan. Pretty self-explanatory. If you have any questions, please let me know. Let's move on to the next slide. This is the same with regards to Iran. And what's important here is sensitive technology means hardware, software, telecommunications equipment, or any other technology that is used specifically to restrict the free flow of unbiased information in Iran, to disrupt, monitor, or otherwise restrict speech of the people of Iran, and does not include information or informational materials for the export of which the president does not have the authority to regulate or prohibit. And we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. This is the last group of prohibitions. In addition, this is also relates to Iran, and I'm going to go ahead and pass this slide so you can read this a little further more about restrictions relating to Iran. So we're going to go to the next slide. And just very quickly, in one more slide, we're just going to cover very briefly some additional FAR clauses that come up. For those of you that aren't familiar with the CAGE code, just so you know, a CAGE code is commercial and government entity number. This number is given to you when you register in SAM. Let's take a look at the next slide. This slide I'm going to breeze over, but this relates to if you need an identifier assigned by a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, or NATO Support and Procurement Agency. Let's go over to the next slide. This slide this FAR provision discusses 52204-16. This is the Commercial and Government Entity Code reporting. This is where you have to report that information based on the requirements of the FAR, and it's for your immediate owner and your highest level owner. Let's go to the next page. This is what that looks like. This is FAR 52204-17, ownership and control of the offeror. You have to identify whether or not you have an immediate owner or any higher owner, and you have to identify those entities by their CAGE code here. Let's go on to the next page. Specifically in construction contracts, you'll see FAR 52223-3. This is hazardous materials, identification of materials safety data sheets. This provision is included in solicitations and contracts where the contract will require the delivery of hazardous materials. These hazardous materials include any material defined as hazardous under the latest version of Federal Standard number 313. Let's go on to the next slide. Here you're going to represent whether or not you have not only an immediate owner, but additionally, you'll provide the following information. Let's take a look at the next slide. And just to wrap up very quickly, all of this is extremely important because you have an obligation to make these representations and certifications that are accurate and true. Congress passed the FCA to ensure and protect the government. Under the FCA, any person who knowingly presents or causes to present a false or fraudulent claim for payment or approval, or knowingly makes or uses or causes to be made or used a false record or statement material to a false or fraudulent claim is liable to the United States government for a civil penalty, if not less than. Additionally, there's treble damages included. And in fiscal year 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice obtained more than $2.2 billion in settlements and judgments from the fraud and false claim matters. Next slide. So here's that $2.2 billion. This is just not, your representation and certification should not be just another form you sign. Your signature means that you knowingly presented yourself to the government. So take care and due diligence when you're filling out these documents. I know we've covered a lot of ground. Next slide. In this hour, it was a quick hour. If you have specific questions on any of these provisions, any of these FAR provisions, I'm happy to discuss them with you. My contact information is on the screen in front of you. And thank you very much for your attendance, and I will turn it back over to Hunter.
Thank you so much, Diana, for a great presentation and sharing your time with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And please join us next week on Wednesday at 11 a.m. as we cover the DFARS Part 252 of this special topic series. Thank you.